notes so that in case you feel you might have missed something, then you can just simply rewatch the recording at your own pace. For the coming give or take 30 minutes, Okey and myself will take you through the topic of why should you get started with organizational culture? And perhaps even more importantly, how can you get started with organizational culture? We will be using this Cisco environment. We have everybody muted to ensure optimal audio visual pleasure during this 30 minutes. Afterwards, we have a give or take 10-15 minutes worth of Q&A. So I strongly recommend that if you hear anything or don't hear things that you did want to hear, please make good use of pen and paper and or the chat screen, and Okey and myself will do our best to answer every single question to the best of our ability. That being said, let's get started on why should you get started with organizational culture. Before we get on that journey, bit of a background. My name is Egbert Schram. I am the Group CEO at Hofstede Insights, and my area of expertise and passion is where people and business meet. So basically business and HR. Dutch native, living here in Finland, and that's in a nutshell who I am. Okey, could you give us a bit of an introduction on yourself?
Thank you very much, Egbert. So my name is Okere. Okey is short form for Okechukwu, and I'm Nigerian. I live in Nigeria. I did my schooling here in Nigeria and some of my schooling as well in the Netherlands. At the moment I am in Ghana, helping to launch our partnership here in Ghana and also expand across other countries in Africa. My focus has been business analysis and strategy and financial analysis. And after a while, I realized that human beings are the real essence of a business and how they work together. The culture that they have is really what distinguishes one business from another. That's the reason why I got involved with culture studies and I got into Hofstede Insights.
Thank you so much, Okey, for that introduction. So let's do a quick poll among everybody present in this call here. And if you could be so kind to go to menti.com and use the code 35210635 to answer the question, why are you interested in organizational culture? So what drives your interest in this particular topic? And we'll give it a minute or so to see what kind of answers come in before we share that plenary. So I'll mute myself for a moment. So please go to menti.com, use the code 35210635 and reflect on that question. Why are you interested in organizational culture? And we have our first brave respondent already with their answer. As we are about 40 people or so, I will wait for a few more answers. And now they're coming in. So let's see what differentiates our interest or unites our interest. So give it 10 more seconds and then we'll share the screen.
And of course, if you're just joining us now, please go to menti.com and use the code 35210635 and answer this question. Why are you interested in organizational culture? Why are you here today in this call?
So here we have an overview of some of the motivations for people to be with us here today. Create a great place to work, strategic topic, use it in lecturing, HR-related responsibilities, diversity and inclusion, need to understand it, cross-cultural training background and how to connect that to organizational culture. So we have a very diverse base of reflections here. And that is actually one of the most beautiful things when we talk about organizational culture, which is that there is a very broad range of topics that it touches upon and that it can provide insights on. So when we talk about Hofstede insights, and what we offer in the field of organizational culture is basically over 35 years of experience with regards to how to visualize organizational culture in terms of providing a framework of reference that talks about the way people work inside an organization and to which extent that way supports the strategy execution or hinders it. So it's a very rational approach. We do this using knowledge from around the globe, like, for example, the two gentlemen you have in front of me have two very different backgrounds, but are united with their passion on combining people and strategy. We connect organizational culture, which is the rational element, to the emotional drivers within an organization to make sure that the way in which people work is also emotionally sustainable. So these are some of the main reasons why we at Hofstede Insights are among the front runners when it comes to making a topic as complicated and as diverse as organizational culture a very tangible asset to work with. Now, what is it that we're going to talk about today? In a moment, we'll start that discussion on, okay, how do we define at Hofstede Insights organizational culture and how does that connect to business reality? What is it that you need to know before you start on an organizational cultural development path? How can you design a perfect culture with clients? Is there such a thing as a perfect culture? And therefore, in the end, what does that then mean? Having set into this webinar for 30 minutes, what's next? So that's roughly what we're going to do in the coming remaining 25 minutes or so. So let's start that journey with reflecting on how we define organizational culture. Okay, can you walk us through what that actually means in terms of, for example, knowledge?
Thank you very much, Egbert. I'm hoping that people can hear me a lot better now. If you still need me to speak louder, please let me know and I will still try to speak a bit louder. Now, when you look at an organization, oftentimes you tend to see that the people in the front line, the staff, the floor staff, as they are often referred to, happen to be very in touch with the company's clients or the organization's stakeholders, external stakeholders particularly, and they tend to know all the problems that the organization is actually facing. Their supervisors know about 74% of these problems. But unfortunately, when you get into senior management cadre, middle and senior management cadre, the level of awareness of the reality of the organization tends to really dip. Middle managers only know about 9% of the problems of the organization, and the senior managers tend to know only 4%. There are many factors why this happens in an organization, but the sad reality still is oftentimes managers don't really know what is actually going on the shop floor. Now, this brings us to a very interesting discussion about the nature of culture in an organization. There is something that we refer to as the culture opinion that looks at various levels of culture. You have symbols, which refer to things like dress code and things like language. You have heroes, the people that typify what is good or what is admirable about a culture from the perspective of people in that culture. And you have rituals as well, which is how you eat and how you conduct business and how you send emails and the like. These three levels of culture, you will see them predominantly in the organization. They are the things that drive an organization's culture. However, there is still one more level of culture, and that level of culture we refer to as values. Values basically drive national culture, and they tell us about why we feel the way we feel. However, organizational culture, which are driven by the first three items, the first three elements, symbols, heroes, and rituals, together, these three elements, we refer to them as practices. They tell us how we should behave. So values tell us why we feel the way we feel, but practices tell us how we should behave. Egbert or Steve?
And that brings us to the definition that we use when Hofstede Insights talks about organizational culture, which is the way in which members of an organization, basically the employees, the managers, the owners, relate to each other. So how do you relate to your colleagues, to your peers, to your superiors, your subordinates, your stakeholders? How do people relate to their work, that is what they do? And how do they relate to the outside world? To give you an example, people might really like their colleagues, they might even like their boss, they might love their work, but it happens to be that they work for the tax office, which everybody hates. So that does mean that when we talk about transformation in such an organization whereby the outside world can be seen as threatening, we need to be mindful of communicating and developing change practices that are mindful of this. In many organizational cultural approaches, this external context is simply neglected. And that is one of the reasons why our approach is so strong, because nobody works in a vacuum. When we talk about using the methodology that we have, we talk about, among others, a realization of what's the existing culture inside that organization. Does that, or to which extent does it enable or hinder the execution of the strategy? What is the culture that you need, which is not the same as what you would like, because what you like is a sandcastle. It's in an ideal world, we like to be very goal-oriented, we like to be very open, and then reality hits. GDPR means you can't be as open because there are all kinds of processes nowadays that dictate how and when and where you can share information, which again impacts how we relate to our work. When we talk about change readiness, how ready are people to change? Sometimes it is not that people don't want to change, but they might not understand why is it needed. They might not understand what it is that they need to change, and they might not understand how to change. We need to understand how do we develop a consistent change journey so that, for example, when we want to make our organization more team-oriented, let's put it an example, but we keep rewarding individuals, people hear one thing and experience another thing, which leads to a breakdown in trust, which will basically stall any transformation project. So a very important thing in our methodology is the ability to create a consistent approach to cultural analytics and change. Now, when we reflect on what leaders have to deal with the challenge of culture, okay, what is it that research has shown us is a challenge for leaders when it comes to culture?
Now, a lot of research has gone into how culture, the role that culture plays in an organization. And recent research, as you can see here, shows that executives, about 90% of executives have said that culture is important. Over 92% said if they improve culture, it will increase their value. However, only 15% of execs actually believe that their culture is where it needs to be. The role of culture is very important in an organization. Again, you see from what you see here, it's over 60% of new ventures fail because of the team dynamics, basically the culture of the team. And when you now even go into other countries, you tend to see that culture plays an even bigger role. Only 17% cross-border investments add value. 83% of them do not add value. And again, 9 out of 10 startups, 10 businesses fail. And most of that is due to the dynamics between the team. So we cannot ignore the effect of culture in an organization, whether it's an organization that you're setting up or an organization that you need to transform. Egbert, could you please go to the next one? Yeah, over to you.
Yes, so knowing what we now know, which is that culture is something that touches a lot of people for a variety of reasons, and a lot of executives struggle in making culture tangible. What is it that you need to know when you start an organizational culture project, whether that is in a corporate role, being HR or change management or development, L&D, or in a role of a consultant? What is it that you really must know? Let's reflect on a particular case. This is a case where we worked on, and it's about 2 years old, where we had a company, a client that worked in the medical product sector, point of care instruments, and it is known publicly, case studies have been written about it around, that it was extremely efficient. That organization faced problems with the speed of innovation, and therefore new CEO came in with a new strategic focus on becoming agile and lean. Now, in a normal workshop situation, participants might say, okay, so we basically need to fail fast and learn fast, and all kinds of very, very masculine language. The point is, if you really want to have a meaningful discussion on answering the question that is posed here, which is what should be the optimal culture for an organization in this context with this particular challenge, is you need a framework of reference. Basically, you need an understanding of what kind of organizational dilemmas are touched upon by this particular context. Dilemmas such as goal orientation, dilemmas such as control and risk-taking. In other words, every cultural project within an organization has to start with an understanding of what is the kind of culture we need in order to reach our strategic objectives. Now, okay, how do we go about this? Okay, you're muted.
My apologies. So very important question. I still see, and apologies to everyone who can hear me very well. We're still working on the audio to make sure that it's better. I don't know if it's much better now, but please try and listen in. And of course, we will do our best to make sure it is clearer. There are many approaches towards transforming culture. Some of these approaches are qualitative, oftentimes quite difficult to actually explain. There really isn't a clear methodology in many cases. But we believe if you want to transform your culture, you need to use a structured approach that is based on data. We believe that you can actually quantify culture and measure culture. As they say, the devil is in the details. When you are able to measure your culture, you will be able to empirically identify the issues that you have, the things that will inhibit your company from your organization from achieving its strategic objectives. So we use a structured method that involves understanding the complex reality, visualizing that complex reality using numbers so that you can know where you can surgically intervene as a company. And also, we use this structured method based on data to identify, understand the sub-strategies and the subcultures within the organization. So it is definitely a structured approach that will be used to make that happen. Egbert? So then we have to ask this question. How do you go about designing a perfect culture? How do we do that with our clients? How do we help our clients? Well, we have to first of all let you know that contrary to popular HR beliefs nowadays, and apologies with due respect to everyone who's in the HR practice here, there is no good culture and there is no bad culture. Usually when I people would ask me, what about toxic cultures? Well, what is toxic to you may not be toxic to someone else or to another organization. What works for them may not work for you. And why is that so? Organizations are different. And why are they different? They are different because they have different strategic objectives. They have different value systems. At least the leaders of the organization, the people who founded the organization might actually have different value systems and different objectives that they are pursuing. So a culture in your organization will be good for you if it is functional. And when we say your culture is functional, we mean it is aligned with your strategy. And then your organizational culture will be, in quote, bad for you, or specifically dysfunctional for your organization if it does not align with your strategy. So this is really a very important foundation for us to understand. You don't have a one-size-fits-all approach. In our work, when we help our clients, we first of all understand their strategy, and then from that perspective, we can help them to begin to design a culture that can support their strategy.
Thank you. Okay, so how do we go about this in practice? As we discussed earlier, and I'll walk you through this, is that when we talk about culture, there are 4 ways, in a way, to talk about culture that you can see in the industry. There is the way organizations tend to think they are. That's basically perception. It would normally come out when you do interviews or you ask people the question, can you please describe our culture? And you get a feedback from people with regards to what is their opinion. Then there are sometimes organizations that talk about culture from the way they would like it to be. And this is basically what we call desired culture. And the funny thing is, desired culture is pretty much the same all across the globe, irrespective of national culture. By far, the majority of people want to work in a very goal-oriented, open, and employee-oriented organization. So that is an emotional need, which basically we all share because we're humans. Then there is the actual culture, the way an organization actually is. And this is something that we basically measure. And I'll talk more about how we do that in a moment. Now, the actual culture as described by Okey doesn't really tell us necessarily that much, because whether it is functional or dysfunctional depends on the strategy of the organization. In other words, if an organization wants to have an open culture, the strategic questions to ask are, what is the risk of data leakage? What is the costs of data leakage? If an organization wants to be exceptionally professional, meaning there is only a focus on being loyal to the job, not to the organization, not to the team, not to any particular individual, is that something that is useful or not? If you work in an industry where it is easy to find people, then loyalty is less important, because if somebody leaves, fine, you replace them with somebody else. If you work in an industry where there is a lot of knowledge intensivity, meaning you can't really afford to let go of people, then you need to basically tailor your organizational context to take that into account. In other words, what is functional or not really depends on what is it that you need to have, and that in itself is impacted by the context in which the organization or parts of the organization find themselves. Now, in the approach that we have, we use a set of survey batteries, different surveys to capture different context. We capture the reality of an entire organization by asking the CEO or chairman of the board to describe their context. We ask functional leaders, this could be a hierarchical leader, could be a function, could be an office location or a factory location, to reflect upon their reality, which might be different from the CEO's. And then we basically ask a representative sample, or pretty much anybody, as we do not charge per respondent, so anybody can be surveyed. What is it that they observe? Number one, the actual culture. And what are their desires? And we do measure that desire, because sometimes you find very interesting things, meaning that although people work in different ways, they actually want the same. Well, that's fantastic, because it means in your communication, you can now touch this nerve, which is that although we are different, we want the same. Much more positivity. Then we basically combine that in a different suite of reports for different purposes. A gap report to help focus what is it that we want to prioritize from a change perspective. a change lever report to capture what is the change path that we want to build across these layers of the onion that Okey talked about earlier. In other words, if we want a certain value to really come out in the way we work, we must make sure that we represent that value symbolically. We must make sure that we celebrate the people that display that value in their behavior. And we must make sure that we reward that with the infrastructure that we have in place. Reward and benefit policies, to name an example. So those are some examples. There is a very clear pathway, a methodology whereby we start with setting the targets which are connected to the strategic objectives of the organization, the actual measurement, the definition of change priority, focus, the actual gap analysis, and from there we get into that change path design to make sure any change done is consistent with the values of the organization, with the practices that have been measured, and in a cross-national setting, also the national cultural differences, because going about change will vary from one country to the other. Now, how do we come up with the insights that we measure? Basically, what we ask is for every particular dimension in the multi-focus model and organizational culture that we use, we ask 6 to 9 questions depending on the dimension. People have to answer a question with option A, neutral, or option B. We average out any averages, and we basically apply answer pattern analytics to look at the variance in answers. Now, this variance is important because we map that with a benchmark database in our own database, and we can basically from there derive how strong is the culture. If there is very little variance, meaning everybody thinks about their work in the same way, that tells us something. However, a strong culture might not necessarily be good, because if everybody is working in the same way, but that way is counter to the strategy, you've got a problem. So this is basically how we capture what happens in between people. We don't aggregate individual results because then you get an average, and averages don't really tell us very much. What we're interested in is the pattern. Now, okay.
So, yeah, thank you very much. So, how do you start with organizational culture? Where do you start? How do you get started with this? So we're going to just quickly tell you how you can get started. The first thing you have to realize is culture flows from the top down to everybody. The culture change and the culture you want to see in your organization must first be embodied and displayed by the leadership of the organization. So we must ensure that leaders walk the talk. And as Egbert has also, part of the things that we do, it will be help leaders to see areas in which they can improve their behavior so that they can model the optimal culture for the organization. The next thing to remember is that you must have consistency from the inside to the outside. You must make sure that your message is consistent and that your change also is aligned. And then the third thing is you must clearly understand you have gaps in your culture. And remember again, as I mentioned, we have the actual culture and we have the optimal culture. We will help you identify where these gaps are and you to prioritize which of these gaps you need to change. And then the last thing is you must constantly remember to balance your culture with your strategy. Culture and strategy must be aligned. And like Egbert also said, no matter how good your strategy is, if you don't have a culture that supports it, that strategy is going to fail. And the same way, even if your culture seems to be quite good, if it is not helping your strategy, you need to change. Culture and strategy must be balanced. They must be aligned. And when we say culture and strategy, we are specifically speaking about the right culture for your organization. And that culture and strategy would help your organizational performance to improve.
Thank you. Okay. So where does that leave you at this particular point in 29 minutes after we started? Which is that there are two ways to basically explore the methodologies that we have. The first option is that if you are an organization and you are facing cultural challenges, or you're experiencing cultural challenges, or you think you can optimize your culture to better fit the strategic goals, is that we can engage in a consulting relationship where we analyze the culture within the organization and provide this gap analysis and the change path consistency roadmap. The second thing, which is specifically for both consultants, but also for internal change ambassadors or navigators, basically people that are tasked with transforming an organization, or perhaps even simply understanding what is the culture inside the organization, is to become certified and certified accredited practitioner, which means that you get trained in the methodology we use. You get to use the metrics involved to basically engage in cultural analytics and change. We've been doing this for, as said, over 3 decades, so we have gained quite a lot of experience. And as such, the following 2 courses are starting in September. One course which is specifically aimed at India and surroundings, which starts on September 14th and is optimized for the APAC time zone. And the other course, which starts on September 1st, which is optimized for the European and North American time zone. And again, both courses are about, give or take, 42 hours worth of virtual sessions. Included in the listed prices is an actual analysis process, because that is required to fulfill the certification, and the coaching on the job to get that first assignment done. So it's really very much a hands-on certification course. After becoming certified, you can basically use the methodology to assess additional units inside your own organization, or if you're a consultant, additional organizations. If you are interested in engaging, then basically you are joining a very extensive list of organizations across verticals. So we are not any particular vertical specialist. We work with sectors in the finance world, FCMG, consumer goods, medical environment, pharma. Basically, the list is endless. Over the last, give or take, 30 plus years, we have served more than 5,000 organizations. And every year that list grows with about 200 organizations that leverage the methodology in various forms, some of them independently, others in collaboration with us. This is what we had to share with you. We do hope that take the time to watch the recording, then the audio challenges due to unstable internet should also be more manageable. We still have about 10-15 minutes worth of Q&A time. So if you have any questions, now the time is there to put your questions in the chat screen for us to reflect upon. And I will stop sharing my screen so I can see everybody in front of me. There we go. And then I will make sure that I've got my chat somewhere here. There we go. So we have a first question that was shared. What can you do as an individual inside an organization, not being the top leader? So what can you do if you're a regular employee to help live the organizational culture inside an organization? Okay, in your experience, what can normal employees do? Those that are not responsible for strategy, what can they do?
That's a very interesting question. And I'll first of all start by saying, as they say, no man is an island, and no a tree doesn't make a forest. We must always understand that culture is a group thing. The first question I would ask to that individual is what level of influence, and I'm choosing my words very carefully, what level of influence, it's not authority necessarily, but what level of influence do you have in the organization? Because even if you are very well behaved as a good staff on the shop floor and you have very little influence on other people in the organization, sadly, you might not be able to make a significant level of change. And then, but again, if you have influence and you don't have the right behavior, as the case might be, of course, you will be influencing people in the wrong direction. So how much influence do you have is one question. If you are influential enough, do you really know what you have to change? might have influence, and you might think that, well, this is the right kind of behavior that we need to embody as an organization. But unfortunately, if you've not done a proper assessment of your culture to know the optimal culture for your organization, your behavioral change may not actually move the organization forward. So to sum it up, you must have influence, and apart from having influence, you need to know what to change as a member of the organization.
Thank you. Okay. And I think this is a very important reflection, and it actually does not only apply to leadership, but in my opinion, it applies to everybody, which is, do you walk the talk? In other words, are you aware of what is the optimal culture? So one of the things you can do, even if you have no influence, is to basically ask your manager, dear manager, how should I behave here to make sure that I display the behavior that the organization finds important? So that is something that basically people can always try to bring up for discussion. So we are getting quite a lot of questions here. Let's take a next question, which has actually already been answered. What are the languages that the multi-focus model is available in? So the survey itself is available at the moment in about 30 different languages, and my colleagues have put the link to the actual product in the chat screen, where you can also find what are the languages that are available at the moment. The list that is online might not even be the most recent one, as we have added 6 languages in the last 2 months alone, but it's about, give or take, 30 different languages, the survey. So the idea there is that respondents should ideally always be able to fill out the survey in as close as a native tongue as possible. In case we need to add additional languages, that's normally not really a big issue. That's done rather quickly. Then we have a question with regards to how do we apply benchmark in organizational culture? Now, as Okey mentioned earlier, every organization is unique. Even if 2 organizations work in the same industry, let's say facility services, the fact is they have different owners. They have different financial situation. They have a different history. Even if they share the same strategy, which is not very likely, all of these different factors that influence the culture of an organization need to be taken into account, as they can be both a weakness but also a strength to really help an organization to find its competitive edge. So when we talk about benchmark, is what we benchmark in our answer pattern analytics is what are the trends in behavior that we can see in an organization that we measure, and where have we seen this before, which guides those that facilitate the measurement, basically the accredited practitioners, the certified people. It guides them in having these discussions with a client. So the benchmark is not to say we want a Netflix culture, because you can't. Or even better said, why would you want to? The benchmark is about what are the patterns that we see and what can they mean in practice. So that's basically how you can apply a meaningful benchmark. The second element in terms of a meaningful benchmark is what is your strategy and where do your current ways of working support that strategy or hinder it. Even when you work in a way that doesn't support the strategy, it means you can still reach your strategy. It simply will take more time or more resources. Then I will ask one question to Okey here in terms of diversity. Okey, I know that you've been recently working on a large diversity analysis with regards to Nigerian organizations. What are your tips in terms of convincing leadership with regards to applying the Hofstede Insights multi-focus model to answering questions regarding diversity and inclusion?
Thank you, Egbert. So the first thing I would say is we have to, first of all, get the leaders to appreciate the value of diversity in the workplace. So they must, first of all, appreciate the fact that diversity is a plus. It's not just something to tick the box with or to engage in tokenism, in the sense that you just want to show that you have a diverse a gender diverse staff group or ethnically diverse management group. It's important, first of all, to recognize the benefit of diversity, the benefit of having people with different backgrounds who will bring different viewpoints to the organization. So that's the first thing. They must recognize that. And when they recognize that, we can now be able to explain to them how Hofstede's models and our multi-focus model can indeed help with diversity. For those of us who were on the call from the beginning, you'll recall that Egbert mentioned that we have 6 dimensions of organizational culture. Now, some of these dimensions, particularly dimension 1, dimension 2, dimension 4, and dimension 6, they touch on diversity amongst all the other dimensions as well. There are certain changes you can make to your organization that will improve your organizational push towards diversity, how your organization will be able to assimilate people with different perspectives. There are certain changes you will make, certain organizational culture changes you will make using our model that will point you in the direction of how you can improve your level of diversity. But like I said again, it is important to first of all appreciate the fact that diverse organizations outperform well-managed, I'll have to say that properly, well-managed diverse organizations outperform their competitors. Once you see the value of having a diverse workforce, diverse management group, then you can now begin to work on diversity using our model. Egbert?
Thank you. Okay. Another way to basically address that discussion on diversity and inclusion is to analyze 2 groups within your organization. One group that is very diverse and a group that is not diverse, see what are the cultural differences between these 2 groups and connect it to particular indicators such as innovativeness, efficiency, profitability. That way you can get actual factual data that is normally required to get the more conservative leadership teams to actually understand from a numerical point of view why diversity actually can make business sense. So I would start with the analytical approach, connected to certain indicators that you know are important for your leadership team. And normally the results will show that more diverse teams or cultures that are more diversity enabling can also lead to better business results if they are and when they are well managed. Now we have a question. Yeah.
But if I may, because I saw a question that I think is very interesting. Someone asked, what are the typical time frames to change culture? And of course, they asked for our contact information. I will start from there. You can get our contact information by going to our website, and I'm sure some of our team members will be able to send you an email address that you can reach us with. But I want to talk specifically about the time frame. The first thing is a culture assessment that we can help with usually can take from us as quickly as 3 weeks to about 6 weeks, depending on your speed. Usually we recommend that you can complete the assessment in about 6 weeks. But then the advice that we will provide and the changes that you have to make, this is something that will depend a lot on your organization and your level of readiness to make changes. We've seen organizations transform their culture in about 18 months. A very encouraging story we have from one of our clients where they were able to transform their culture within 18 months, return to a higher level of profitability and improved their performance amazingly. But many other organizations usually would require 3 to 5 years before they see concrete, sustainable changes within the organization. In the short run, you might be able to see some changes immediately, but oftentimes for those changes to be sustained, you need to have a program management plan that will ensure that the benefits of this change are reinforced over a period of 3 to 5 years so that they can become embodied in the organization, they can become concretized, they can become almost second nature and become indeed a culture in the organization. Egbert, do you want to say something on that as well?
No, I think that's a nice summary of the time frame itself in terms of the engagement scope. Maybe to add there are several elements that impact the time frame needed when specifically we talk about transformation. And this is, for example, if an organization is stock listed, things might take a little bit more time because there are a lot more administrative items to take into account. But with our approach, pretty much any organization can transform elements of their culture, if not all of their culture, within 1.5 to, let's say, 2 to 3 years, assuming organizations are ready to really reflect thoroughly in terms of the different elements of that onion that we spoke about earlier. So when we talk about that onion, we talk about what are the policies that an organization have? What's the onboarding process? What is the infrastructure? I mean, now we tend to work virtually, but and that means that a desktop screensaver is easy to change, but the looks and feels of an actual building might be a bit more difficult to change. So there are quite a few elements that impact that time frame, and that's why one of those elements when we engage with clients is to understand their reality so that we can have good expectation management. There are a few more questions left, but as we're running out of time, I will take one final question before we can follow up on any open question in a follow-up email that also shares the recording with you. And that is related to, let's see, it was asked earlier, what is the certification contract about? So if you want to become certified in using the Hofstede Insights methodology to analyze either your own organization or if you're a consultant, multiple organization, is that it is in effect a extended NDA, which means that there are ways in which you can use the methodology that must be honored. There are pricing included, basically an overview of what are the costs involved in terms of when you do a measurement, and there are certain conditions described in terms of what is the validity of the certification, which in practice basically means that in order for consultants to keep their knowledge up to date, or any practitioner, whether they're a consultant or not, to keep their knowledge up to date, is that we do require them to do at least one project every 12 months. Otherwise, it is too easy to lose out on the knowledge and understanding of the methodology. So that's basically in terms of expectation management, what that contract is about. It basically describes the conditions in terms of use, the pricing involved, and what you must be doing in terms of keeping that certification alive, which is quite easily summarized as in do at least one project per year, and it continues to run as long as you keep doing that. So that's it basically for us for today. Thank you, Okey, for joining in from Ghana, and looking forward to the launch of our Ghana commercial partnership tomorrow. For all of the participants, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. If your question has not been answered today, please do feel free to reach out to us via sales@hofstedeinsights.com. My colleagues nicely gave the right address there. So if your questions were not answered here and you seriously must have that question answered because otherwise you can't go into your weekend, reach out to sales@hofstedeinsights.com, and we look forward to continuing to build on our engagement with you. That's it for today. Wishing you a very pleasant continuation and looking forward to staying in touch. Cheers and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye. Do stay in touch. Connect on LinkedIn if you can as well. See you soon. Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.